thank everyone for joining us, and especially want to thank the Davenport Institute at Pepperdine University for partnering with ELGL once again on this webinar series. Today we're talking about economic development and local government and COVID-19. I'm ELGL Executive Director Kirsten Wyatt, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's presentation. ELGL is the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network, and we engage the brightest minds in local government. And one of the ways we do this is to provide exceptional and free online trainings and conversations just like today. So we know that businesses have been hit hard during this pandemic, especially small-scale family-run restaurants and shops. And we know that local governments have been working hard to help their local businesses by encouraging takeout and curbside pickup. So today we want to talk about how cities and counties can continue to engage with their business communities and encourage community members to do the same. And so we have an all-star panel comprised of some of my favorite people in local government. Mark Nelson is the Economic Development Manager for the city of Roanoke, Virginia. He's also my friend from graduate school, and he was a groomsman in my wedding. Matt Lorenzen is the Economic Development Director for the city of Estacada, Oregon, which is a small community right outside of Portland. And Catherine, you know I love you. I cannot pronounce your last name.
Geanuracus.
Geanuracus, there you go, is the CEO and co-founder of
Rolls off the
CityGrows.
tongue.
If you are more interested in, if you would like to learn more about CityGrows, please check out elgl.org. Yesterday we posted a blog about work that they have done in West Hollywood, California, and it's absolutely exceptional. And you can learn how CityGrows is helping local governments right now in real life. And she'll provide her perspective as well. So this webinar is free for ELGL members, and if you've logged on and you're not yet a member, we would love to have you join. Memberships are $40 a year, and you can sign up at elgl.org/membership. We are recording today's webinar, and we will save that and share it in ELGL's webinar library. And we are also streaming this webinar live into the ELGL members Facebook group. And so before we begin, I just want to remind all of you that you're muted. And so if you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please use that chat box. And then afterward, when we have some time for Q&A, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question to our speakers yourself. And then I'll make sure that I ask the questions that are in the chat, so our recording includes that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley with the Davenport Institute, and she's going to lead today's discussion for us. Thank you so much, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kirsten. And just to add to what Kirsten said about feeling free to use the chat box to ask questions, we've also found in our last few webinars that oftentimes those of you who are listening in have some of your own ideas and projects that you're working on or insights. So feel free to share those in the chat box as well, and we'll probably call on you to unmute yourself and share a little bit more, but that's also an opportunity. We really want this to be interactive. And I'm very excited to have Catherine, Mark, and Matt on with us. I think this is a really important, I want to just start by setting the context of why this conversation is so important. I think we live in an age where conversations can so easily become simplified, and simplified conversations become polarized. And so a lot of times in the conversation around COVID, it's set up as kind of an either or with public health and economics. And there's really difficult trade-offs that need to be made here, and hard decisions to be made. And as we try to protect people from the virus, I think it's important to really emphasize that a lot of the questions surrounding business and economy are also public health questions, or at least relate to public health. There are physical impacts of mental health. We live in an age where that's we're becoming slightly more aware of this. There's still a lot of work to be done in actually elevating mental health to the position that it needs to have in our conversations. There's also physical health impacts of unemployment and of poverty that are really well researched and long-term. So when we're having these conversations around how do we protect people from the virus, how do we spur on the economy, it's not sort of a conversation about health and then a conversation about making money. There really are health impacts to the business side of this conversation. And I want to put that out there right up front to recognize that these are challenging things that we're wrestling with, and they're difficult trade-offs to be made. For those of you who have been on any of our webinars so far, you already know that the Davenport Institute's mission is to help build stronger communities by promoting public participation in governance. We are working on helping governments move beyond seeing engagement as either public relations or advocacy, which has kind of been where we've been for the last half century or more, and really to invite the full diversity of voices to the table to engage meaningfully in local policy. And that means inviting our communities to wrestle with trade-offs and inform difficult decisions. So while this focus of this webinar is really on supporting the business community in creative ways, I want to push beyond just here's an idea we had as government or here's something we've tried to see how we're engaging the concerns and the creativity of our business communities, as well as of our residents, who of course are the prospective customers of their communities, as we're trying to continue to support business in the midst of a really challenging situation. So I want to kick it off by just opening with one question. We know that businesses and local governments are constrained by public health mandates related to social distancing, mask wearing. We also know that beyond the actual mandates, there's the importance of people feeling safe, right? Someone's not going to go out to eat, even if it's technically allowed for there to be a sidewalk dining or something like that. People won't do that if they don't feel safe. And it's also important to consider the safety of employees as they're reporting to work. So I'm interested in knowing some ways, and this question is probably more for Mark and Matt than for Catherine. We'll definitely get to Catherine as we go through, but what are some ways that you've seen governments and business engaging with the full community as they're trying to understand and respond to the safety concerns from the employee or resident side? And Mark, you were just talking about your school district doing this, so I'm wondering if you might want to start out by talking about how government more broadly has done this in Roanoke. Oh, and you're still muted.
I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. One of the things that's been really helpful for us is that the tone was set pretty early at the state level. Those of us who know who our governor is know that he has some other issues that he's had to deal with prior to COVID. But since the outbreak of the pandemic, his stance has really, and that of almost all the elected officials in the state, has been very consistent in handling how the safety concerns and the things that are addressing the public. So that has set a tone for us, I think, that is really helpful, because if you have a strong underlying overarching base for that, then you're able to move forward with the policies that you set. And one of the things we had to do early on was the city of Roanoke has a big regional greenway system that loops around the city. And this is not directly economic development related, but it sort of is. And at one point, very early in the process, there's a very popular stretch of greenway where you could see the day after recommendations came out about social distancing and masks, I looked out on that greenway and you saw run clubs with 30 people running together. People were out grouped together and nobody was taking it seriously. And so city management took a very controversial turn and decided to shut down that portion of the greenway. And they did it for 3 months. And it caused a lot of consternation. And people were very upset by it. But ultimately what it did was it showed the tone that this is serious, and people adjusted. And they opened it back up and you can since use it, but people understood how serious this was. And they understood that they needed to follow certain guidelines. For us, the way it flowed into the Economic Development Office, the initial couple of months were helping take stock of our businesses. Where are you? What do you need? Are you doing okay? How is this impacting you? And then we worked largely with our small business development offices to help them as EIDL and and PPP funding started to come through. And so from there, we progressed to when CARES funding came through, our council and our city manager's office formed a community-wide group called Star City Strong, about 40 people from across the community, and they laid out the different priorities the community would have and where funding would go. And then they set up, part of that was about $1 million worth of small business funds that we're able to distribute through CARES grants. So we took a gradual approach, sort of taking stock first, setting the tone as to how serious this was, and then reaching out to businesses afterwards. Does that answer your question?
It does. I think that raises a really interesting point. And this is one of the things that we talk about frequently in our Davenport Institute trainings, but that continues to be a challenge, and something that I think really requires discernment and a leadership skill, which is there are times the government needs to make the decisions, right? There are times where really the engagement with the public is just, this is what needs to happen right now.
Right.
But then there's the times where you really need to start bringing the community voices in. And then even when you make that decision, it's the question of, do we go to the whole public? Are we doing workshops, which obviously face-to-face at least isn't happening right now, but are we doing surveys? Are we trying to reach the full diversity of our community? Or is this something that needs people to be able to wrestle? And so we need to limit the size and have more of a stakeholder group, which it sounds like is kind of where you went with your CARES Act funding. But this is a place, and I think that's a perfect example of the type of response where at that point, if the government's just making the decision saying, you know, we're the economic experts, we're going to look and say, hey, we think the money needs to go here and here.
Right.
You're really going to end up not only hurting your relationship with the community, but potentially missing out on something that the community may have insights into. So I think that's a really, really helpful conversation about just how challenging this is. Matt, you are in a very small community and with a small government. Tell us a little bit about what this has looked like for you guys.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So just for context, the population in Estacada is about 3,700 people, so small. As such, you know, capacity and staffing, budgets, you know, constrained in a lot of ways. And so we've leaned pretty heavily on the county and on the state for a lot. Initially, as far as outreach to the community goes, the city as an entity, as a holistic entity, was not doing a lot, but rather just sort of making sure that the state's communications were relayed through our channels. But as an economic development department of one, I've made a point of keeping the communication line very open with our businesses. And so that's come in basically two forms. I have a MailChimp account with about 1,000 subscribers and have pushed out regular communications to let businesses and whoever else is listening to that broadcast, as it were, to make sure that they're aware of what's happening and why and what the latest updates are. Things were moving very quickly, especially in the very beginning as far as regulations go, here in the state of Oregon at least. Size of gatherings, where masks were required, what age groups were required to wear them, etc. Which businesses were allowed to operate under what circumstances and at what times. And so that communication piece was pretty important. And so I did that primarily through email, and the readership, as I can see on my dashboard, was probably the best that it's been. I've had that newsletter for a period of time now, but during COVID, my readership has been the strongest and my click percentages have been the strongest. So people are paying attention, and that is reassuring. I get responses to it and questions. I've used that to also push out grant opportunities, and businesses have been appreciative of that as well. We haven't had the capacity to do a local, hyperlocal grant program the way municipalities throughout the state and country have. One other thing I'll say that I can say we have not done, but I've seen other communities do, even small ones. You know, the mask wearing and the tight regulation of businesses, especially certain types of businesses, restaurants in particular, can feel, I think, heavy-handed, and you know, big government is telling us what to do and how to operate our businesses. And so I've seen several coastal communities in Oregon, and there may be others, instead of just using the state PR messaging and imaging for the mask up encouragement and enforcement, they've done local campaigns with more playful themes. So on the coast, for example, they're using sea animals wearing masks and making it more playful and inviting people to be part of the solution in a playful manner, rather than that heavy-handed government feeling of you must all wear masks now. And, and that can kind of tend to get under the skin of especially those who are more inclined to believe in a small government sort of philosophy in this country. And so I think that you can help bridge that gap and make that mask wearing and the regulatory environment perhaps a little bit more palatable to those folks by making it a little bit more playful and inviting people to be part of the solution rather than just commanding. So those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Well, and knowing the
sign.
culture.
Oh, I saw a sign yesterday that was like 3 like acceptable masks, and then the far right was Batman with like an X, and it was like, not the hero we need right now. Mask faces, and like it was in a coastal community here in California. It's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, and knowing your culture, knowing the culture of your community, right, plays a role in even knowing what humor is going to fly, what people will respond to. I also think that sets us up a little bit.
Ashley,
Go ahead, Catherine.
Quickly say, so one thing that we've seen in some of the, particularly around this question around like the restaurant requirements, we've seen some of our governments feel kind of caught in between state mandates and their local community. One of the things that we did with Erie County, Pennsylvania, which there was a red, green, yellow system for counties in Pennsylvania, and Erie was one of the later ones to go green. So they set up a sort of optional restaurant reopening kind of guide workflow on CityGrows. All of our CityGrows workflows that are specific to COVID are free to any government. And it wasn't a requirement. Like they similarly had some real tension around state requirements versus local attitudes, I think. And so they made it optional, but then as restaurants started to go through it, they learned things that they hadn't kind of gotten from just a flat PDF from the state. Here, I can quickly, if you want, I can show what it looks like, but it was just this really easy sort of like online questionnaire that restaurants did. And they—
Yeah, I think Kirsten can maybe make you a co-host so you can share your screen.
Not required, but and we got feedback from restaurants that they really hadn't thought about some of this stuff and they appreciated it, especially in terms of their like employee health protections, right? So anyway, I think that's something too, like helping local governments feel like they're in control of the messaging and the process a little bit more when some of this stuff is coming from the state level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and actually leads very much into the question kind of that I was going to ask you actually, Catherine. So thank you for anticipating me. But just is this question to when there are the guidelines, you're caught in those places, there's the communications piece, right? And I know that there were cities, here in California, actually this came up in our last webinar, the city of Morgan Hill thought they had the green light to do sidewalk dining and then had the public health department come in and start closing businesses with no word to the city, no word to the businesses. So there can be those things. And I think going to kind of what Matt said about this feeling of overstep in government, Catherine, you've done a lot of work with government processes, and I know you're working with local governments, so we'll leave the state problems to state governments. But just in terms of what are ways that you've seen governments sort of shift processes, you answered this a little bit with that Erie County example, to where at least it feels like they are not the barrier, right? Where they're not standing in the way.
I've been so impressed. And as everybody in this call knows, like local government doesn't right? The rep is not like incredibly fast change, right? Like that's not what local government's known for, right? But we've actually seen like remarkable responsiveness, I think, in some of our local government partners where the governments themselves are trying so hard to create opportunities for their businesses to be able to operate. And this is, we have been doing sidewalk dining permits for 6 or 7 different communities, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And like the city of West Hollywood, which was featured in the ELGL article this week, like they changed one ordinance on a Monday and we were able to put that into practice on a Tuesday for like literally they're trying so hard to make these accommodations for restaurants because they have to change their code around like how can a restaurant operate. Like for example, they had codes around whether or not you could serve alcohol outside. They changed those like as quickly as they could to facilitate full outdoor dining operations, especially when, and this, to your point, the state of California closed indoor dining with basically no notice in July. And so people scrambled really fast. You know, it had been open, it was closed. Like, how are you gonna, like, it was really frustrating and challenging for businesses. And so we saw the local folks, we support sidewalk dining for the city of Los Angeles, which we're a very small company to be doing that, but they didn't have other solutions that could change as quickly on the tech side to do that. And the staff was really motivated to change their requirements as quickly as possible and to get those businesses operating as safely and as quickly as they could. I'm impressed, honestly.
Yeah, that has been my biggest takeaway from the last 6 months is, you know, I've always worked with really smart, I always tell people, everyone I work with in local government are all the Leslie Knoves. Like, I don't work with Ron Swansons. They're all the people who like are there to change the world, but they still get frustrated because, you know, and I hear from our clients, from the people I train, from the people I work with, we're government, I have these ideas, we can't get them done. We can't innovate, we can't pivot, we can't do these things. And there are so many ways, whether it's from, I think, again, City of LA had something like 10% of their employees had some level of work from home capability. And then within 2 weeks, they had 95% of their employees working from home or something. I might not have the percentages right, but it was that type of a spread. So whether it's changing HR policies, whether it's changing sidewalk dining policies, whether it's changing, you know, early on before dining was open at all, even allowing takeout of alcohol and some of those things that had been, so just being able to say, here's a problem, we need a solution, and we're willing to do what it takes to make that solution happen quickly is something that I think this crisis has proven government can do. And I think it's something that we need to realize residents are expecting already, right? Residents are used to their feedback informing something and either being told why their feedback can't be taken into account, which I think is a really important piece of this. And I'm interested in hearing, especially from Mark and Matt, if there are ways you've engaged the resident. Matt, even if it's just through your email, your MailChimp email, and then people are giving questions to you and you're trying to respond to them. How have you closed the loop with residents in terms of saying, this is what can happen, this is what can't happen, here's where we may have some flexibility. Mark, that's probably more on your end as a slightly bigger community, but here's where we may have some flexibility and how we'll try to take this into account. And here's just, you know what, we're really in the midst of this county or state mandate. We can't do anything about it, but we're at least gonna let you know. So maybe starting with Matt and then going to Mark.
This is a tough one because oftentimes the answer has been, hey, sorry, there's not a lot we can do, but at least taking the time to respond and to let them know why we're constrained in this particular situation. One of the themes that I've had to respond to pretty regularly here is, why can't the city of Estacada sort of exercise its autonomy as a municipality and tell the state and or the county to go shove it, we're going to do our own thing in Estacada. Whether that be, you know, changes to mask wearing policies, getting rid of them altogether, reopening businesses before the state says we're allowed to, and so forth. And communicating back to folks and helping them to sort of understand how the system as it is works is something we've had to do. So I can make personal email responses to people because we're that small. I can make house calls to businesses that have concerns and go knock on their door and have a face-to-face conversation. that's one of the luxuries of being so small. It's also a challenge as well, but maybe Mark has some further insight.
Well, you know, one of the things that we were able to do is, I'll give you an example where we've had flexibility. We had a resident and a business owner come to us and they said, you know, I've noticed that in Tampa and in Cincinnati and other places, you know, Roanoke is a city of about 100,000 people and a metro of about 300 to 350,000. Our downtown is very vibrant, but it's not that big. So when you look at places like Cincinnati and Tampa, sometimes there may be a temptation to say, we can't do that. We don't have that size. But in this case, we had an business owner come to us and say, why couldn't we do more outdoor dining? Why couldn't they take portions of the sidewalk or the street and block them off? And they took that to us and to our planning director, and our planning director actually said, you know what, these are not normal times. And they went to the city manager and said, how do we do this differently? And so you started to see that open up a little bit more, and not just downtown, but we also have a couple of different eclectic neighborhoods around the city. And so that was an instance where normally you would say, we can't block traffic, we can't you know, impede this sort of thing or that sort of thing. But in this case, restaurants were fighting for survival in a lot of cases. And then there was also the idea of, you know, takeaway was good, people enjoyed that, but some people do want to go to these restaurants and enjoy dining, even if it's outside. So that was an example, I think, where we put aside the whole idea of what you can or cannot do, what good planning principles would be under normal circumstances, and helped make good planning principles and good business decisions in a time that's very unusual.
That's a great example of just finding flexibilities where you can, because I do think those trade-offs, again, to actually think through, okay, in this moment, are we going to upset more people by taking away a parking lane or something like that downtown? Probably not. There's probably less, there's not shopping going on. There's not a lot of business going on. So there is the ability to have more flexibility than we might have at another time. And being able to take those suggestions from the community and find a way to implement them when we can. I think it's also it's a frustrating time for people. And as someone who is very pro-local government and whose entire career has been based around the fact that what works in Berkeley is not going to work in Bakersfield and what works in LA is not, I do think, kind of to Matt, to your point, some of the concerns of your residents may be legitimate. You know, it may be that we're honestly sitting there saying, we're not Portland. We are 3,000 people. We're not at the same risk level, and yet those decisions still being handed down. So being able to find those ways of finding some level of local autonomy and decision-making is, I think, really valuable. Maybe starting with, oh, go ahead. I was gonna start with you, but jump in.
No, go ahead. That's cool.
No, I'd like to hear your question.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's interesting. So we worked with, one of the things that we've seen from our really small governments, because we work with everybody from 4,000 person governments up to the city of Los Angeles, is that there have been some really hyper-local campaigns, some sort of hyper-local grant programs. Like we supported another Oregon community, actually Newport, Oregon, they got like a local philanthropist who gave a small amount of money for very small business grants. Like, I think they were basically like $5,000 grants, right, per business, relatively early in the pandemic, and we helped them sort of accept applications and distribute those. So we've seen, like, that's the kind of thing that like maybe wouldn't, you know, maybe there were 20 of those grants, right? But which wouldn't have a dent in a bigger community, but like really mattered in a small community, right? And I think the challenge that you mentioned about City of LA working from home, like certainly many smaller governments have often never worked from home and didn't have the tech systems in place to support remote work, right? And one thing we see all the time is that folks in local government have really great ideas, but sometimes the systems they're working with aren't flexible enough to help them carry them out. And so we've been super proud to be able to, like, we work with this town, Lake Barrington, Illinois. It's a few thousand people. It's like a far out suburb in Chicago. And their council waived all their business license fees for the year. They still want the businesses to get licensed, but they waived any fee payment to just do what they could to support their businesses, right? And so we were really psyched we could just like take the fee off our like we just took it off, and then there was no, you know, and they refunded the ones that already paid, and like that kind of flexibility is hard to get sometimes, but is really important, you see, in these crises. So.
Yeah, I love that both Matt, I just was gonna say, I love that both Matt and Catherine have brought up some of the advantages along with the, you know, Matt can knock on every business door if he needs to.
Almost. Yeah, so similarly, we, in the beginning of all this, when cities were launching grant campaigns to keep businesses afloat, and we're sitting there looking at, you know, dollars and cents, unable to do something like that in our city, we said, what can we do? And even token things can make a big difference, even if it's just the gesture of it. So what we did for restaurants in particular is reduce their sewer units all the way down to like 1. So, I mean, it's a small thing. I'm not sure how much it saved them and whether or not, you know, it changed whether or not they would stay afloat. But again, the gesture of it and letting them know that someone's in their corner, that the city's in their corner, I think was fairly big, especially for those mom and pop restaurants. And we were able to do that quickly and with the stroke of a pen again, yeah, because we're small.
So Catherine kind of already answered a little bit of my next question, which was just what are the things, what is something that's proving particularly challenging for your community? It's small, and you know, Catherine mentioned the even the technological capabilities and those types of things, and the ways they've been supporting this. So what, and we've kind of addressed these, I think, a little bit for all of them, but what's one thing that's proven really challenging? Would it be that connection to you're just not in charge of that much as a tiny city, and so you're pretty much communicating higher level things? Or are there other things that have been challenging?
Yeah, I mean, we have the same autonomy as a city that's 100 times the size of ours. So it's not so much, I guess, that we are in charge of very little, but effectively we're in charge of less because of the budgetary constraints and staff constraints and so forth. So I understand what you mean. You know, what was particularly difficult for me as the economic development manager was to see neighboring cities, larger cities, launch these grant programs awarding funds towards businesses' mortgage payments, utility costs, even staff expenses. And to not be able to offer that was, you know, it felt crappy. But the county designed a program of their own. We're in Clackamas County, which has an urban portion in the Portland metro area, and then a rural portion, which is where we are. And at the original program design, that program was only going to reach businesses in unincorporated Clackamas County. So not only did we not have our own program that we could have, but we also were getting written out of the county program. And I let them know that that was, that I struggled with that. And I will say that they ended up including the rural areas in that grant program when it was launched. And so that was a challenge, one in that particular instance that we had a small victory on. But yeah, not being able to offer local direct financial assistance has been challenging in terms of, you know, almost legitimacy. And, you know, we tell our businesses as ECDEV people, we're here to help you. And then when crisis really hits and be able to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, that is not a good feeling. So to be able to get that small win and include our businesses in the county program was pretty cool. And we did have several grant awards in our community. So yeah.
Great. Mark, what have been some of the challenges for you in particular in Roanoke?
Well, in the state of Virginia, you have what's called independent cities. We talked a little bit about this earlier. So whereas in a lot of places, and I've also worked in North Carolina and Georgia, where it's a very different structure. Whereas if you're in a city, say you're in Roanoke and you're in Roanoke County, you're a city within a county. And in most states, that means the county handles schools, the county handles a lot of like the health department and things like that. But in the state of Virginia, independent cities mean you have to do everything yourself. So there's a city school and a county school, and there's city jails and county jails. And then there are city economic development departments and county economic development departments. And those programs are very separate. This is very specific, but one of the frustrating things for us has been, the county launched its own version of a CARES grant process with the funding it received from the federal government, and then we launched ours. And in some instances, there have been businesses that have moved from the city to the county for whatever reason. In some cases, it was driven by COVID, but in other cases, it wasn't. And when they applied for a grant through the city, their argument was, I sustained these losses in the city, but now I'm in the county. And so they get caught in that kind of glitch in the middle because the county they're not eligible in the county because they weren't there when the losses were sustained, but they're not eligible in the city either because, they don't have, part of our application process was that they expressed to us how they're going to operate and recover moving forward within the city. So they're sort of in that netherworld between the two, which doesn't make them eligible for either program. There's not a lot of people that are in that category, but the ones that are tend to be the smallest and most vulnerable. They tend to be home-based businesses or very small shops, not so proprietary, but maybe 1 or 2 employees, 3 employees. And that, touching on what Matt said, it's very frustrating because you're there to say, hey, we're here to help. Anytime you need something, come to us. And then to have to go back to them and say, look, this is an instance where we can't help. That's very frustrating. It didn't happen a lot, but if it happens once or twice, it still weighs on you.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to make sure that we leave time for some questions. And it looks like some people have been sharing their own ideas in the chat box. So I will turn to Kirsten in just a moment. But before we do, if each of you, and Mark, since you're still large on my screen from just having talked, maybe you can start and then Catherine and Matt can finish us up. What is one accomplishment or one thing that you think you've done really well in supporting your business and your community during this time that you and maybe you've already touched on it and you're like, yeah, that was it. But I'd really like to hear just what's kind of the takeaway for you.
I think it goes back to the Star City Strong task force that was assembled by the city manager's office and by council. One of the things that we've done really well is that even before COVID, the city council and the city manager's office had made equity a priority. And they actually placed someone within our office that handles equity issues. Her name is Aisha Johnson, and she's great at what she does. I just had to put a plug in there. But in order to make sure that the money that we got from CARES is broadly spread across different parts of the community, they really did take the time and the pains to bring 40 people in and to conduct these Zoom calls. You know how confusing it is with 2 people on a Zoom call. Try 40 and having a discussion. And they broke it out by priorities. They could have just lumped all the money into economic development and be done with it. But they knew there were nonprofits that were going to be touched by this, by business owners, by different kinds of groups that would need that funding. And so they really took the time to break down what those priorities were and where the money should go. And then once we received the money we got from the business side, we've been able to really distill down the essential things that we needed to do to get the money out as quickly as we could. And so the process is very thorough. It's not instant, but it's pretty close to instant. And all the folks in our office have been working very hard. And the way we pulled together to help get that money out, that's the thing I'm probably most proud of. That was a little wordy, I apologize. But
no, but I can see why it's something you're proud of. That's great. Catherine. Oh, still muted.
I was just going to quickly actually show you the thing that I'm most proud of. So this is City of LA's LA Al Fresco. This is their basic sidewalk and private property dining permit. And you can see what happened when indoor dining was closed in July.
Yeah.
But this is the thing I'm most proud of. This 19 minutes of being able to issue this permit from start to finish. So which means that the city decided to default to yes, right? So that means if you applied as a business and you answered all the questions correctly and you agreed online to the covenants and you signed off and like, our system has logic, so you can, make sure that the questions were answered appropriately. If they didn't trigger any of the like warning signs, they just got issued the permit and they could print that permit right there. And so that's the thing that I think most proud of for City of LA and for us as a technology company, is that we could facilitate that. You can see there's almost 2,000 that have been issued already. And like the idea that the City of LA would issue any permit in 19 minutes is like unheard of, right? So I'm super proud that they not only like are using our technology to do that, but that they allowed the policy position to let that happen, right? And I think that's just a good example of cities really taking advantage. I'm going to just quickly show you too just this fun picture, which is City of West Hollywood, and they're out like kind of taking street lanes, and of course West Hollywood is really into their branding, so it's all very like work out, shop out.
I'm still seeing your al fresco
Oh,
one
sorry.
though. Did you?
Let me see if I can change that.
Tabs?
Anyway, I'll pull that up later. Anyway, thanks.
That's awesome. Great. Matt, what's something you've been proud of in your little community that you've been able to accomplish or support businesses?
At the risk of repetition, I'll say we've done what we can, and I feel pretty strongly that that's true. So things like the outdoor dining, we've made those changes. I talked about the sewer units. And then I'll also just say the communications piece. It's I'm proud to say that there have been several businesses that have reached out and said, hey, because of your newsletter, I applied for PPP and I got funded, and I'm halfway through the forgiveness process. And I wouldn't have understood that loan, quote unquote, was effectively a forgivable loan grant if it weren't for your newsletter. Or, hey, I got this state level grant because I saw, and I never would have seen otherwise, information about it in your newsletter. So I feel like we've done what we can, and that the communications piece has been really crucial and has really benefited several businesses at a minimum directly, the ones I've heard from. Yeah.
That's great. I love that communications is so significant there, because I think a lot of times for government, you mentioned this a little bit, that you've had this newsletter for a while, you've built your audience, no one really clicked on it, you kind of have it hanging out there. And I think a lot of times, whether it's with one-way communications or with the effort to engage residents in both directions, there can be this frustration of we're trying and no one's coming. But you've created a portal where when people do need it, they know where to go. They may not need it at other times. They may not feel like it's, I think we tend to feel like everything is very relevant to you. You should care about all of the things. And people are busy. Their attention's spread across different places. But as we build those things, we may not initially see the response to it, but we're creating channels that people then can go to when they need them. So that's great. Kirsten, we took a lot of time talking today because your favorite people are super interesting, so thank you. But what are some things from the chat box we might want to share with the whole group, or questions or whatever?
Before I get to that, I do want to point out for our attendees, you should take a look at Matt's newsletters. He and I live in the same town. I'm not in Estacada, but I get his newsletters, and they really are a great example of a well-done economic development newsletter with really good messaging. It's very well written. And so if you need a model, or if you haven't yet implemented that sort of outreach, get on Matt's list. It's really well done. And I think he gets annoyed because I do reply to his newsletters, even though I'm not a business owner in Estacada. And I'm like, you're doing such a good job, but it really is exceptional. So I encourage you to use him as a model.
I do the same thing to your newsletters, Kirsten.
Again, this is all like Leslie Nopes of people that love government too. So I loved your comparison there, Ashley. So I want to thank all of our attendees. We have some great examples in the chat of different ways that their communities have done outreach and engagement around masking and social distancing. And I don't see any questions yet, but please feel free to unmute yourself, ask any questions or you can drop it into the chat. But I think one thing I'll throw out there is, how have you been dealing with the inevitable closures of businesses? What have you seen? What has been effective? And how have maybe your governing body or your elected officials gotten involved more with economic development, given that, you know, there has been such a huge impact in your communities?
Does anybody?
Go for it, Mark.
Okay. Well, I think ours is, and I keep circling back to the same thing, and I apologize, but one of the ways our elected officials really have gotten involved is that task force I mentioned numerous times, the Star City Strong. That was their way of saying this is going to touch a lot of different parts of the community, and that we need to be in tune with all those different things and all those different people. So that task force has really helped. I think by and large, they've done a great job of supporting us and supporting the city manager's office. We've been very boots on the ground. We have a staff that's been working weekends to process applications. They're working overtime. They're doing everything they can. We don't yet know how many businesses are going to close. You hear anecdotally of businesses closing, and it's tragic because we know each person has a dream when they build that business, and the effort and time that is put into it. And so they have supported us, our elected officials have, primarily not just through the Star City Strong, but from being there anecdotally. If we call upon them to say, this business person wants to speak to someone in council about this, they plug right in, you know, and they've also been very good at not only plugging right in, but giving the right amount of space to the city manager and to the economic development office to help get things done. That's kind of a roundabout answer. I don't know if that answers the question. If not, I can elaborate.
I like the fact that part of your response has been to go to the community through that task force and say, what is it that we need? Because I think you're right. And I love that you just brought that up. When a business closes, especially the types of business that are most likely to be closing in this sort of a crisis, right, you're talking about someone's dreams, right? You're talking years and years of investment. It's not the same thing as even being laid off from another job where okay, I have a skill set, I'll just move it over here, I'll apply for jobs. I mean, that anyone who's been laid off knows how painful that is. But when you're talking about the closure of a business, usually you're talking about years of investment, planning, dream building, that's closing down. And there probably aren't any, there is no golden bullet solution. There's no here, we've fixed everything. But the idea of saying, we want to help you and we don't know exactly how to best help you, so we're going to pull people together to have that conversation, I think is really powerful.
I'll also chime in and say one of the luxuries of being small, again, is having an economy that's sort of small enough to be able to wrap your arms around. And so when we've had businesses close so far, that I'm aware of, it's only been one sort of highly visible, well-loved business that's faced closure. And we were able to celebrate that business in the newsletter by thanking for their time in the community. And then, and I hope this didn't feel like a sting to them, it wasn't in the same newsletter, it was in a subsequent one, helping that building owner to then advertise that space for the next generation business that's going to plug in. That's, you know, creative destruction is sometimes one of the things that comes out of these crises. It was what happened in the last economic downturn as well. It really is unfortunate when businesses go away, and you hate to see that, but I do have some confidence that with business closure means an opportunity for another business to fill that space, either figuratively or physically in this situation where there's a building that needs to be occupied. And I'll report it is now occupied.
That idea of celebrating someone's contributions, I think, is significant. To say you may no longer be in business, and there's an acknowledgement of that loss, but also a recognition that they're still part of the community and have been part of the community, contributed to the community.
That's well said.
That's great. Well, we are heading toward 11. I think we still have time for another question if any come up. In the meantime, I want to thank all of our participants for your insights. It's so fascinating. One of the things I love about working with ELGL is, I come up with an idea of something I want to talk about, and Kirsten helps plug me in with people literally all over the country. So it's always a really diverse set of perspectives, and such a fun conversation to have. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your Wednesday. For those of you listening, I see some familiar names in the list of participants. We have 2 of our professional certificate alumni, at least, and there may be others, but I've seen at least 2 names that I recognize. The Davenport Institute has what was a 3-day in-person professional certificate on public engagement, specifically focused for local government. So how do you engage the full diversity of resident voices? And it's been a really fun a fun program to host on our Malibu campus. This fall, we are unable to do that, but we have converted it virtually, so it will be 1 session per week for each of the weeks of October and the first week of November. So if you need some distraction from political craziness in October, November, please consider, and if you enjoy these types of conversations, consider that. It's my shameless plug. Taylor Palmer has just dropped the link for the program into the chat box, and would love to see more people there. ELGL has been a great partner for us. Also, we have a final conversation, a final webinar in this series. This is our 2nd series we've done with ELGL. I'm doubting it will be our last, but at least for this round, our final offering will be next week, same time. And it will be looking at creative ways that governments are partnering for community building. What are some creative ways that they're really striving to keep connected with the community, not so much on the decision policymaking side, but on the relationship building, and continuing to make people feel part of the community in a time when maybe we're not bumping into each other quite the same way. So those are kind of my pitches. Catherine?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so we, from the beginning of COVID, we put out an offer to any government that any COVID specific workflows on our platform are completely free. We've had many governments take us up on that. Some of them have become customers afterwards, but some have not, and we really mean it. There's like very little marginal cost for us to have more governments using our workflows. We also make it very easy to copy what other governments have done. So if you're curious to see what Santa Monica or West Hollywood or Chelsea, Massachusetts have done for sidewalk dining, it's really easy for me to just clone one of those and share it with you guys. It's how we help people get up and running with our workflows very quickly. We're also committed just to being super low cost. Like, we really believe, especially now that all sizes of local governments really need digital services. One of the real challenges we see that people's existing tech, which like a lot of times, as you guys know, hasn't been replaced for years and years and years, can't support online applications or work from home for staff. We're really built to do that. So I would invite anybody who's on the call who has any interest in doing a COVID or non-specific COVID workflow, please check out CityGrows. I'll drop our URL on the chat, or you can just email me. I'll put that in the chat too. So thank you so much. We love ELGL so much. Y'all are the best.
And I just want to echo Catherine there. They're offering a ton of resources for COVID, but their commitment to this definitely precedes COVID. And that was one of the really exciting things with reconnecting with Catherine after she had jumped into the CityGrows work, was seeing that commitment to making good government workflow processes available to governments that don't have the budget to even budget capacity, all of the different things that go into it. We want small communities to have access to the same systems that large cities are doing. And I love that about your work, Catherine. So thank you. It's just kind of a, a fun fest over here. So this is great. Kirsten, any final comments from you?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, we did record today, and so I'll send you all the recording. I'll send you the links from the chat. So you have all of the great takeaways offered by our attendees today, as well as the resources shared by our speakers. But, mostly just a huge thank you to Catherine, Matt, and Mark for sharing their work with us today. And then, of course, ELGL loves working with the Davenport Institute. We really encourage all of you to check out their certificate program. And again, save the date. Next week, same time, we'll be talking about creativity and local government, which are two of my favorite topics. And so I hope you can be there to be part of that discussion with us as well. So with that, we'll close things up for the day, but I'll be in touch with an email to all of you later today with the recording and more follow-up information.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.